Operation Barbarossa, 1941.
On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa sent over 3 million Axis troops across an 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union. Hitler's goal was to conquer the USSR in a single decisive campaign, defeating the Soviets before winter arrived. The invasion began with stunning success. German forces advanced hundreds of miles, encircled entire Soviet armies, and destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft. For a few months, it looked like Hitler's gamble might pay off. But Operation Barbarossa was doomed before it started, and the reasons why reveal a textbook case of strategic delusion.
First, no winter preparation. German planners genuinely believed the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 12 weeks. They were so confident that they didn't issue winter clothing, didn't winterize vehicles, and didn't stockpile cold weather supplies. When the Soviets didn't surrender on schedule, German troops found themselves fighting in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees, wearing summer uniforms. Second, impossible logistics. The deeper Germany advanced into Soviet territory, the longer their supply lines became. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel hundreds, then thousands of miles over roads that turned into impassable mud during rain and froze solid in winter. German tanks literally ran out of fuel within sight of Moscow. Third, underestimating Soviet manpower and will. German intelligence believed the USSR had about 200 divisions. The actual number was closer to 400, and the Soviets kept raising more. Hitler assumed Soviet society would crumble under pressure. Instead, Soviet resistance intensified. The entire premise of a quick victory was based on fantasy. Fourth, ignoring historical precedent. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia had failed for almost identical reasons: overextended supply lines, brutal winter, and underestimating Russian determination. German generals knew this history. Hitler dismissed it as irrelevant. The outcome. By December 1941, Operation Barbarossa had stalled. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive that drove German forces back from Moscow. What was supposed to be an 8-week campaign turned into a 4-year meat grinder that cost Germany over 4 million casualties and ultimately destroyed the Wehrmacht. The war on the Eastern Front wasn't lost at Stalingrad or Kursk. It was lost in the planning rooms of Berlin, where ideology replaced logistics and wishful thinking replaced intelligence.
The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. In April 1961, the United States launched a covert invasion of Cuba. The plan was simple: land 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, trigger a popular uprising against Fidel Castro, and overthrow the communist government. The invasion failed in less than 3 days. Of the 1,400 invaders, over 1,100 were captured. The rest were killed. No uprising materialized. Castro's government grew stronger. The United States suffered one of its most humiliating Cold War defeats. But the invasion was never going to work. The plan was built on assumptions that weren't just wrong, they were delusional.
First, catastrophically bad intelligence. The CIA believed Castro's government was fragile and unpopular. They assumed Cuban civilians would rise up to support the invasion. In reality, Castro had widespread support, especially among rural Cubans who had benefited from land reforms. The expected uprising never had a chance of happening because it was based on completely false information about Cuban society. Second, no air support. The original plan included American airstrikes to destroy Castro's small air force before the invasion. President Kennedy canceled the strikes at the last minute to maintain plausible deniability of U.S. involvement. This left the invaders completely vulnerable. Castro's planes sank supply ships, strafed landing beaches, and prevented reinforcements from arriving. Third, the Bay of Pigs was a trap. The Bay of Pigs was chosen because it was remote and had an airstrip, but it was also surrounded by swamps with only 3 narrow roads leading out, easily defended choke points. The Cuban military knew the invasion was coming. Soviet intelligence had warned them, so they simply blocked the roads and waited. The invaders had nowhere to go. Fourth, no contingency plan. The entire operation depended on a popular uprising that intelligence couldn't confirm was likely. When that didn't happen, there was no backup strategy. The invaders couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, and couldn't blend into a population that didn't support them.
The outcome. Within 72 hours, the invasion was over. Castro paraded captured invaders on television, proving to the world that the U.S. had tried and failed to overthrow his government. Rather than weakening Castro, the Bay of Pigs strengthened his position domestically and internationally. The invasion failed because it was based on what planners wanted to be true, rather than what actually was true. No amount of training or courage could overcome a plan built on fiction.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. Soviet leaders believed their superior military technology and modern tactics would quickly crush poorly armed Afghan resistance fighters. They expected the war to last a few months. It lasted 10 years. The Soviets suffered over 15,000 deaths, 50,000 wounded, and countless cases of psychological trauma. They withdrew in defeat in 1989. Leaving behind a country in ruins and the Soviet military demoralized and humiliated. The Afghan War didn't just fail, it helped destroy the Soviet Union itself, and it was doomed from the very first day. First, impassable terrain. Afghanistan is one of the most mountainous, rugged countries on Earth. Soviet tanks, helicopters, and mechanized infantry were designed for European plains, not Afghan mountains and desert valleys. Mujahideen fighters controlled the high ground, used caves and tunnels the Soviets couldn't locate, and ambushed supply convoys on narrow mountain roads. The environment itself was a weapon the Soviets couldn't counter. Second, no control over the population. The Soviets held cities and major roads. That was it. Afghan villages remained under Mujahideen control or were simply abandoned. Rural Afghans had no loyalty to the communist government and every reason to resist foreign occupation. The Soviets could win battles. They couldn't win the war because they never controlled the people. Third, external support for insurgents. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other countries funneled billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Mujahideen, including Stinger missiles that neutralized Soviet air superiority. The Soviets weren't just fighting Afghan guerrillas, they were fighting a proxy war they couldn't win through military force alone. Fourth, no exit strategy. Soviet leadership couldn't define what victory looked like. Install a stable communist government? That government had no legitimacy. Eliminate all resistance? Impossible in a country where resistance was decentralized and endless. The longer they stayed, the worse it got, but they had no plan for leaving without admitting defeat. The outcome. By the late 1980s, the Soviet military was bleeding resources, morale, and credibility. The war became so unpopular that it destabilized Soviet domestic politics. When Mikhail Gorbachev finally ordered withdrawal in 1989, he essentially admitted the entire decade-long campaign had accomplished nothing. Afghanistan earned its nickname, the graveyard of empires. The Soviets learned what the British had learned a century earlier. You can invade Afghanistan, but you cannot hold it.
The Italian invasion of Greece, 1940.
On October 28, 1940, Benito Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Italian-controlled Albania. Mussolini was jealous of Hitler's conquests and wanted his own military victory to prove Italy's strength. He told his generals that Greece would fall within weeks. Instead, the Greeks stopped the Italian advance, then counterattacked and pushed Italian forces back into Albania. Within months, Hitler had to bail Mussolini out by invading Greece himself with German troops. Italy's attempt at conquest became an international embarrassment. The invasion failed because it was never based on military logic. It was based on Mussolini's ego.
First, wrong season, wrong terrain. Mussolini launched the invasion in late October, just as winter was arriving in the Greek mountains. Italian troops had to fight uphill in freezing rain, snow, and mud. Supply lines through Albanian mountains became impassable. Frostbite and exposure killed as many soldiers as combat. The Greeks, fighting on home terrain they knew intimately, had every advantage. Second, underestimating Greek determination. Mussolini assumed the Greeks would surrender quickly rather than fight a hopeless war. He was completely wrong. Greek soldiers, fighting to defend their homeland, fought with ferocity and skill that shocked the Italians. Greek commanders outmaneuvered Italian generals at every turn. Third, overriding military advice. Italian generals warned Mussolini that the army wasn't ready, that winter was approaching, that more time was needed for preparation. Mussolini ignored all of it. He wanted glory, and he wanted it immediately. His timetable had nothing to do with military reality. Fourth, no clear objective. What was the goal? Occupy all of Greece? Capture Athens? Force a surrender? Mussolini never defined success clearly, so commanders didn't know what they were actually trying to achieve. The invasion was launched to satisfy Mussolini's pride, not to accomplish a strategic objective.
The outcome. By March 1941, the Italians had been pushed back into Albania and were on the defensive. Hitler had to divert German forces, originally intended for Operation Barbarossa, to invade Greece and Yugoslavia. This delayed Barbarossa by several critical weeks, possibly costing Germany its chance to take Moscow before winter. Mussolini's vanity project didn't just fail, it weakened the entire Axis war effort. A doomed war doesn't just lose itself, it drags down everything connected to it.
The Third Anglo-Afghan War, 1919.
In May 1919, Afghanistan's new emir launched an invasion of British India, hoping to exploit British exhaustion after World War I and spark an uprising among Indian Muslims. The war lasted barely 3 months. Afghan forces were defeated, pushed back, and forced to sign a peace treaty. But here's what makes this interesting. Both sides lost. Afghanistan failed militarily. Britain technically won, but the cost and difficulty of the campaign convinced them to grant Afghanistan full independence and stop trying to control Afghan affairs.
This war was doomed for Afghanistan because they couldn't win, and it was doomed for Britain because winning didn't matter.
For Afghanistan, first, misreading British weakness. Yes, Britain was exhausted from World War I, but the British Indian Army was still massive, well-equipped, and experienced. Afghanistan had a much smaller, poorly trained force. Exhaustion doesn't equal helplessness. Second, the uprising that never happened. Like the Bay of Pigs, this plan depended on civilians rising up. Indian Muslims didn't revolt. Without that support, Afghan troops were just invaders fighting alone. For Britain, first, uncontrollable terrain. Even though Britain won battles, they couldn't effectively occupy Afghanistan. Every victory led to guerrilla ambushes. Every road into Afghanistan became a death trap. Second, diminishing returns. Yes, Britain could defeat Afghanistan militarily, but at what cost? The campaign required resources Britain didn't want to spend. Occupying Afghanistan would cost even more. Victory achieved nothing useful. The outcome. Britain won the war, but immediately granted Afghanistan the independence it had been seeking anyway. Afghanistan's military invasion failed, but they got what they wanted diplomatically. Both sides realized the same truth. You can fight in Afghanistan, but you can't win there in any meaningful sense. The pattern holds across centuries. The Vietnam War, American phase, 1965 to 1973. In 1965, the United States began massive military escalation in Vietnam, deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. American commanders believed superior firepower, technology, and training would force North Vietnam to give up. 8 years later, the U.S. withdrew in defeat. Over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese were dead. South Vietnam collapsed anyway. The most powerful military on Earth couldn't win a war against a much poorer, less technologically advanced enemy. Vietnam wasn't lost in 1975 when Saigon fell. It was lost in 1965 when the U.S. committed to a war it didn't understand and couldn't win. First, no clear, achievable objective. What did victory look like? Destroying the North Vietnamese army? They kept rebuilding. Stopping infiltration from the north. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was impossible to cut off completely. Creating a stable South Vietnamese government. That government never achieved legitimacy. Without a clear definition of success, there was no way to know when to stop. Second, fighting ideology with firepower. North Vietnam wasn't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for reunification and independence from foreign control. You can destroy an army with bombs. You can't destroy an idea. The more the U.S. escalated, the more North Vietnamese commitment intensified. Third, underestimating enemy determination. American planners assumed North Vietnam would break under sustained bombing and casualties. They were catastrophically wrong. North Vietnamese leadership was willing to accept losses that would have been politically unthinkable in the U.S. The war wasn't about who had better technology, it was about who was willing to suffer more. Fourth, the home front collapse. The American public would only support the war if it showed clear progress toward victory. Since victory was never clearly defined, progress was impossible to demonstrate. As casualties mounted and the war dragged on, domestic support collapsed. A democracy cannot sustain an unpopular war indefinitely. The outcome. By 1973, the U.S. withdrew under the pretense of peace with honor. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The war America spent a decade fighting ended exactly the way it would have if the U.S. had never intervened. Vietnam proved that even the most powerful military in the world cannot win a war that lacks a winnable objective.